In the pantheon of cinematic works dedicated to the inexhaustible and primal theme of the haunted house, few have achieved the resonance, psychological complexity, and sinister elegance of The Legend of Hell House, 1973. This film emerged during a golden age of horror cinema, a prodigious decade that also saw the birth of undeniable and genre-defining classics like The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby. Directed by British filmmaker John Howe, with a sharp and merciless screenplay by master of speculative fiction Richard Matheson himself, the film stands as a monolith of atmospheric terror. This is not a film for the faint of heart, but not due to an abundance of gore, which is remarkably contained. Its brutality is of a different order, intellectual, psychological, and spiritual. Its greatest triumph is its challenge to the conventions of the jump scare, which even then was becoming a cliché, and its almost clinical immersion into the depths of the human psyche, the nature of evil, and the eternal battle between logic and the inexplicable. It is precisely there, in this abyss of meticulously constructed ambiguities, that its enduring power and unsettling force reside. For contemporary audiences, often subjected to a diet of formulaic horror saturated with digital effects and narratives that underestimate their intelligence, revisiting or discovering The Legend of Hell House is not merely an exercise in historical appreciation, but a rediscovery of what makes horror such a visceral and, paradoxically, philosophical genre. It is an irresistible invitation to enter a space where what is unseen, what is suggested, and what is repressed is infinitely more terrifying than any monster CGI could conjure. The premise, at first glance, might sound familiar, almost archetypal, which in itself demonstrates the lasting influence Matheson's work has had on everything that followed. An eccentric, dying millionaire, Rudolf Deutsch, a man who accumulated all the fortunes of the material world and now faces the ultimate bankruptcy of the body, is obsessed with the one question his money cannot answer. Is there life or consciousness after death? To obtain definitive proof, he hires a team of specialists to spend a week in the notorious and infamous Belasco mansion. This place, described with dark reverence as the Mount Everest of haunted houses, is not just a site of supposed apparitions. It is an epicenter of depravity, a vortex of malevolent energies accumulated over decades of perversions, murder, and blasphemy, all orchestrated by its enigmatic former owner, Emmerich Belasco. The house is not merely haunted, it is sick, an open wound on the face of reality, a psychic cancer that consumes all who dare approach. The team assembled by Deutsch is a brilliantly conceived microcosm of the film's central conflict, a veritable modern psychomachia. On one side we have Dr. Lionel Barrett, a physicist and parapsychologist, portrayed with cold professorial arrogance by Clive Revill. Barrett is the epitome of the man of science, an inflexible skeptic determined to prove his theory that all paranormal phenomena, including those in the Belasco mansion, are mere manifestations of residual electromagnetic energy. He does not believe in spirits or surviving personalities. For him, the house is an uncharged psychic dynamo, a problem to be solved with the right tools. His weapon is a colossal machine, a device of his own invention designed to cleanse the house by absorbing and neutralizing this energy. He enters not as a humble investigator before the unknown, but as a technological exorcist, a conqueror of superstition. His posture exudes the hubris of positivist science, the dogmatic belief that anything that cannot be measured, weighed, and quantified in a laboratory simply does not exist or is a product of hysteria. In diametrical opposition, we have Florence Tanner, brought to life with feverish and moving vulnerability by Pamela Franklin. Florence is a mental medium, a woman whose faith in the spiritual world is as deeply rooted and unshakable as Barrett's skepticism. Where Barrett sees energy equations, she feels the surviving personalities of tortured souls trapped in the house. Her approach is not one of analysis, but of empathy. She seeks not to neutralize, but to communicate, understand, and ultimately heal. She believes that spirits need not be eradicated, but liberated from their pain. Florence becomes an open channel, a gateway for the house's entities, driven by a compassion that tragically proves to be her greatest weakness and her death sentence. The house, or the dominant intelligence inhabiting it, perceives this openness not as an offer of peace, but as an invitation to violation, a weakness to be mercilessly exploited. Florence's tragedy is not that of a foolish believer, but of a genuinely compassionate soul who underestimates the absolute and predatory nature of the evil she faces. She attempts to apply the logic of love and redemption to a force that operates beyond these concepts, a force of pure and selfish corruption. Her empathy, however noble, is also a form of spiritual vanity, the belief that she, and she alone, holds the key to the house's salvation. In the midst of this ideological crossfire, like an island of trauma and pragmatism, is Benjamin Franklin Fisher, portrayed with a restrained, nervous, and unforgettable mastery by Roddy McDowall. Fisher is the living memory of failure, the sole survivor of a previous investigation in the same house 30 years prior, which ended in catastrophe with the death or madness of all his colleagues. He is a physical medium of immense power, but he has shut himself off from the supernatural world as a mechanism of self-preservation. His silence, initial passivity, and refusal to open up are not acts of cowardice, as Barrett sarcastically suggests, but a survival strategy forged in pure terror. Fisher represents a crucial third path for the film's thesis, knowledge that comes from direct experience, a pragmatic wisdom that transcends both abstract scientific theory and naive faith. He knows what the house is capable of because he has felt its devastating power in his own flesh and soul. He instinctively understands that the house is neither a laboratory to be analyzed nor a collection of souls to be saved. It is an intelligent predator to be avoided at all costs. His journey throughout the film is that of a soldier with post-traumatic stress disorder, forced to return to the battlefield that almost annihilated him. He must reactivate his abilities, not out of academic curiosity or missionary compassion, but out of a desperate need to survive and, eventually, to confront and destroy the source of evil. The fourth piece on this infernal chessboard is Anne Barrett, Dr. Barrett's wife, played by Gail Hunnicutt. Initially, she appears as a secondary figure, a passive and skeptical companion like her husband. However, Matheson, with his expertise in character psychology, positions her as one of the most crucial conduits for the house's machinations. The novel is more explicit in stating Lionel's impotence and Anne's deep sexual frustration. The film, though more subtle, maintains this subterranean current of repression. Anne is a woman whose libido and individuality have been stifled by an intellectualized and emotionally sterile marriage. The Belasco house, being an epicenter of unregulated and perverse libidinal energy, detects this repressed hunger and exploits it with diabolical precision. Anne's erotic visions, sleepwalking, and increasingly uninhibited and seductive behavior are not merely symptoms of classic possession. They are manifestations of latent desires that the house's entity skillfully unlocks and amplifies. The house promises Anne the liberation and pleasure her marriage denies her, seducing her with the illusion of power and transgression, transforming her into a weapon against her own husband's sanity and the group's fragile stability. This sexual subtext is absolutely fundamental. The energy permeating the mansion is primarily erotic and sadistic, an echo of the orgies, abuse, and philosophy of power through degradation that marked Emmerich Belasco's reign. The evil here is intrinsically linked to the corruption of desire, to transgression that does not liberate but, on the contrary, enslaves the soul at its source. The depth of the plot, therefore, lies in how the Belasco house, like a psychotherapist from hell, explores and amplifies the flaws, desires, and beliefs of each of these characters. It is a psychological catalyst that functions as a distorted mirror, reflecting and magnifying the internal cracks of its occupants. The house does not primarily attack with floating sheets or dragging chains. It attacks the psyche. For the scientist, it presents physical phenomena that defy his laws. For the medium, it offers voices and visions that manipulate her compassion. For the repressed woman, it offers the fantasy of sexual liberation. For the traumatized survivor, it reenacts the terror of the past. The genius of Matheson and Hoof lies in maintaining a calculated ambiguity about the true nature of the force haunting the mansion for most of the narrative. Are they multiple spirits of Belasco's countless victims? Is it a single polymorphous entity capable of assuming various personas? Or is it, as Barrett stubbornly insists almost to the end, a complex projection of the psychic energy of the mediums themselves, amplified by the oppressive atmosphere of the environment? The film allows us to doubt, actively engaging us in the same debate that divides the protagonists. The medium Florence, in her eagerness to find a redeemable soul amidst the horror, is convinced that she is communicating with Daniel, Belasco's supposedly oppressed and abused son. She projects onto him a narrative of victimization and a search for forgiveness, a story that fits her worldview. The house, with predatory cunning, feeds this belief. It presents itself as a victim to better manipulate its savior. The scene where Florence, in a state of mediumistic trance, is violated by an invisible force is not just a physical attack. It is a psychic rape, a violation of her faith and compassion. The subsequent sequence, in which she, in an act of desperation and disillusionment, tries to destroy the house by attacking its physical manifestations and is crushed by a falling heavy crucifix in the chapel, the mansion's unholy heart, is one of the most symbolically brutal and nihilistic moments in horror cinema history. It is faith being literally crushed by the very symbol that should represent it. It is a blasphemous inversion that signals the absolute and mocking triumph of the entity. The message is clear and merciless. There is no room for compassion, redemption, or the logic of sacrifice in Belasco's personal hell. It is only in the final act, after Barrett's science has also spectacularly failed, his machine, incapable of containing a force that was not merely energetic but conscious and malevolent, overloads and kills him, that the true nature of evil is revealed. With the representatives of faith and science eliminated, the burden falls on Fisher, the man of experience. Forced out of his protective shell, he must confront the entity directly. And it is here that the film's deepest, most disturbing, and ultimately central thesis lies. Fisher, using his mediumistic power in a controlled and focused way, finally understands the great deception. The house is not haunted by a legion of spirits. All the manifestations, all the voices, those of Daniel the son, of the tortured mistresses, all the phenomena were facets of a single, overwhelming, and monstrously egoic presence. Belasco himself. Belasco was not merely a depraved man who left a ghost behind. He was a force of nature, a will to power and corruption so immense, so narcissistic, that he refused to dissipate with death. He merged with the very structure of the house, impregnating every board, every stone, and every speck of dust with his malignant and dominating consciousness. Belasco is not a ghost in the house. He is the house. But the crucial revelation, the key that unlocks the entire mystery, is even more shocking and, to use an expression consistent with the tone, brutally realistic in its psychology. Guided by a final intuition, Fisher discovers a secret, lead-lined room beneath the chapel. There, walled up, lies Belasco's mummified body. And here is the great and pathetic twist. Belasco, the roaring giant, the master of sadism, the man whose legend described him as an imposing and physically dominant figure, was in reality a man of short stature, a dwarf. The legs of his corpse are artificial. He had his own legs amputated and replaced with prostheses to appear taller and more imposing in life. This revelation is the pulsating thematic heart and the deepest, most desolate layer of the legend of Hell House. Absolute evil, the force that defies science, mocks faith, and destroys lives, does not have a grandiose metaphysical origin. It is not Satan, not a primordial demon from another dimension, not a Lovecraftian cosmic entity. It is a pathetically, shamefully human evil. It is born from the most corrosive of feelings, an inferiority complex. All of his philosophy of power, all of his empire of pain and degradation, all of his quest for domination, were born from a man's rage and resentment against his own physical constitution. Belasco's giant was literally a small man. He was not a Nietzschean Superman who transcended morality through sheer willpower. He was a fragile man who, in his fury at feeling diminished, decided to diminish, humiliate, and destroy the entire world, dragging everyone into his personal hell as a form of compensation. His cruelty was not a philosophy but a perverse therapy. His perversion was not a search for pleasure but a cry of pain, hatred, and self-loathing. The mansion then reveals itself as a monumental projection of a fractured psyche, a monument of brick and mortar to male insecurity taken to its most monstrous and lethal consequence. This radical demystification of evil is what makes the film so uncomfortable, and, paradoxically, so timeless and relevant. It is psychologically easy to deal with a demonic evil, an external and supernatural force against which we can unite. It is far more difficult and terrifying to confront the idea that the greatest atrocities, the greatest legacies of terror, can be born from terribly human flaws, from wounded vanities, resentments, and fragile egos. Belasco, in essence, is the personification of tyranny that springs from weakness. He built a legend of terror to hide his own smallness. Fisher's final struggle is not therefore against an almighty specter, but against the toxic legacy and persistent rage of a man who could not accept himself. And the way Fisher defeats him is equally significant and symbolic. He does not use a complex ritual or overwhelming power. He confronts him with the naked truth. He mocks his stature, his deception, his pathetic attempt to be great. He attacks the primordial source of his rage, exposing the pathetic truth behind the legend. And then, in a moment of brilliant synthesis, he activates Barrett's machine, symbolizing the final and necessary union of science, the tool, and psychic perception, the knowledge of how and where to use it, to finally dissipate the concentrated energy of that decades-old hatred. The solution was not in a single method, but in the integration of approaches that were previously in mortal conflict. Reason and intuition needed to unite to defeat the perversion of emotion. In its aesthetic dimension, The Legend of Hell House is a triumph of restraint, atmosphere, and art direction. Director John Huff, clearly inspired by classic psychological haunted house horror, such as Robert Wise's The Haunting, 1963, perfectly understands that true terror resides in suggestion and the violation of personal space. He uses low and distorted camera angles, wide-angle lenses that deform the architecture and create a sense of paranoia, making the mansion itself seem alive, observant, and oppressive. The soundtrack, a pioneering work by the BBC Radiophonic Workshop with Delia Derbyshire and Brian Hodgson, is less a musical score and more a soundscape of disturbing electronic noises, hums, whispers, and destabilizing frequencies that act directly on the viewer's nervous system. The absence of exaggerated special effects and explicit monsters forces our focus onto the extraordinary performances of the cast and the escalating psychological tension, making the impact much deeper and more lasting. Ultimately, the film calls the audience to an uncomfortable reflection on the nature of evil and the mechanics of fear. What we fear in the Belasco mansion is not death, but contamination. We do not fear ghosts, but what they represent, the destructive power of a single, corrupted human will. A will so powerful in its resentment that it survives the decay of the body and seeks to perpetuate its suffering in others for all eternity. The Belasco house is a mirror that reflects the weaknesses of those who dare enter, exploiting them to the breaking point. It teaches us the harsh and realistic lesson that the greatest danger often comes not from cosmic forces or external demons, but from within, both from our own repressions, desires, and insecurities, and from the monumental insecurities of tyrants who, at bottom, are merely small men casting very, very large shadows. The Legend of Hell House offers neither the easy comfort of faith nor the cold certainty of science. Instead, it offers a clinical and relentless diagnosis of the psychology of wickedness. And that is why, more than half a century after its release, its dark corridors still echo with a disturbing and profoundly human truth, inviting each new generation to unravel its mystery and perhaps to confront the pathetic little tyrants hiding in the secret chambers of our own reality. It is a masterpiece that not only frightens but provokes, challenges, and ultimately illuminates the darkest corners, not of the afterlife, but of the fragile human condition itself.